"You don't belong here." The words cut through the elegant ambiance of Meridian fine dining like a knife, sharp and deliberate, designed to humiliate rather than inform. Marcus Bennett, the head waiter who'd worked at the upscale restaurant for 3 years and had developed an unfortunate reputation for being particular about clientele, stood blocking the entrance to the VIP section, with his body positioned to physically prevent passage. His arms were crossed, his expression a mixture of disdain and self-righteous authority, and his voice carried just loud enough that nearby diners turned to observe the confrontation unfolding in real time. Dr. Elena Wright, 41 years old with natural hair styled in elegant locks that fell past her shoulders, and wearing a burgundy dress that had cost more than Marcus probably earned in a week, stood facing him with a calm expression that betrayed none of the anger and humiliation burning in her chest. She had arrived at Meridian to surprise her husband David for their 15th wedding anniversary, carrying a gift she'd spent months planning, a vintage first edition of his favorite novel that she'd finally tracked down through an obscure book dealer in London after years of searching. "I'm meeting someone in the VIP section," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled patience that comes from decades of navigating situations where your presence is questioned and your belonging is challenged based on nothing more than the color of your skin. "My name should be on the reservation under Wright. Party of 2, 7:30. Marcus didn't even glance at his tablet to verify the reservation, his dismissive attitude making clear that he'd already decided she couldn't possibly belong in the exclusive section regardless of what any list might say. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave this area immediately. The VIP section is reserved for premium guests who've been personally approved by ownership, and I don't have any record of your reservation. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our main dining room, where there are several other establishments in the area that might better suit your needs and expectations." The coded language was barely concealed. Other establishments meant cheaper restaurants in different neighborhoods, places where people like her supposedly belonged according to the narrow worldview that had somehow survived intact, despite working in a diverse metropolitan area for years. Elena felt the familiar weight of being black in spaces that hadn't been designed with her inclusion in mind, spaces where her presence was treated as aberration or intrusion rather than ordinary and unremarkable. She'd experienced variations of this encounter countless times throughout her life, in stores where security followed her assuming shoplifting intent, in hotels where desk clerks questioned whether she'd actually booked a room, in airport lounges where she was asked repeatedly to show credentials that white travelers were never required to produce, and now here, in her own husband's restaurant on their anniversary, being told she didn't belong by an employee who couldn't see past his prejudices to recognize that his assumptions were catastrophically wrong. "I'd like to speak with the manager," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite the anger threatening to break through her carefully maintained composure. "There's clearly been some miscommunication, and I'd prefer to resolve this without creating a scene that disrupts other diners' experiences." Marcus's expression shifted from dismissive to actively hostile, as if Elena's reasonable request for managerial intervention was itself an affront to his authority and judgment. "Ma'am, I am the senior dining room manager for this evening, and I'm telling you that you need to leave this area now. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security to escort you from the premises. I'm trying to handle this discreetly and professionally, but you're making that very difficult by insisting on something that simply isn't going to happen. I don't know how you got the impression you'd be dining in our VIP section tonight, but whoever gave you that idea was mistaken, or you misunderstood the arrangement. Either way, I need you to leave immediately before this becomes a larger issue." His hand moved toward the phone at his hostess station in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate, to remind Elena that he held institutional power in this space regardless of who was actually in the right. Several other diners had stopped their conversations entirely now, watching the confrontation with expressions ranging from uncomfortable embarrassment to curiosity about how this drama would unfold. Elena noticed a young white couple at a nearby table whispering to each other, the woman's face reflecting sympathy, while her companion seemed more interested in the spectacle than the injustice playing out before them. An older black gentleman dining alone caught Elena's eye and gave her a slight nod of solidarity and recognition. He'd clearly been in similar situations himself and understood exactly what she was experiencing and why Marcus's behavior was about far more than restaurant policies or reservation confusion. "Marcus, I'm going to say this one more time very clearly," Elena said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel that suggested her patience was approaching its limits. My husband owns this restaurant. His name is David Wright, and if you take 2 seconds to actually check your reservation system instead of making assumptions based on what you think I should or shouldn't have access to, you'll see that I'm expected in the VIP section for our anniversary dinner. The words should have immediately resolved the situation, should have prompted Marcus to check his tablet with genuine attention and discover his mistake, should have resulted in profuse apologies and immediate correction of his behavior. Instead, his expression hardened further, and what came out of his mouth next would end his employment and become the kind of viral video that destroyed reputations and sparked national conversations about racism in service industries. Ma'am, I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play or what you hope to accomplish with these lies, but I've had enough of this disruption. Mr. Wright is the owner of this establishment, and I know for a fact that his wife is not someone who looks like you or would show up here making scenes and causing problems for legitimate guests. Now I'm going to ask you one final time to leave voluntarily, or I'm calling security and the police to have you removed for trespassing and creating a public disturbance. The choice is yours, but you have about 10 seconds to make it before this goes from embarrassing to criminal. Elena felt her face flush hot with anger and humiliation as Marcus's words registered fully. Not just the refusal to believe her, not just the threat of police involvement, but the specific phrase, "not someone who looks like you," that made his racial assumptions explicit and undeniable. She pulled out her phone, her hand steady despite the rage coursing through her body, and began recording the encounter because she'd learned long ago that without documentation, these stories were dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding rather than acknowledged as the routine indignities that people of color navigated constantly. "I'm recording this interaction for my own protection," she announced clearly. "Marcus, you've just stated on camera that you don't believe I could be Mr. Wright's wife because of how I look. I want you to clarify exactly what you meant by that statement, and I want you to explain what policies or procedures justify your refusal to verify the reservation information I've provided before threatening me with arrest." Marcus's face flushed red as he realized he'd been recorded making statements that sounded even worse when repeated back to him than they'd felt coming out of his mouth in the heat of confrontation. I meant that I know Mr. Wright's wife. I've met her before, and you're clearly not her. This isn't about race, it's about preventing fraud and protecting our establishment from people trying to scam their way into exclusive areas by claiming connections they don't have. If you were really Mr. Wright's wife, you'd understand that we have security protocols to protect high-profile guests, and you wouldn't be so offended by routine verification procedures. The backpedaling was clumsy and unconvincing, his attempt to reframe blatant racial profiling as legitimate security measures fooling absolutely no one who'd witnessed the encounter from its beginning. Elena had been treated as a threat from the moment she approached the VIP entrance, before any questions about verification or reservations had even been raised, and everyone watching understood that Marcus's assumptions had been based on her appearance rather than her behavior or any actual security concerns. A young woman in server attire approached hesitantly, her name tag identifying her as Jessica Chen, and she addressed Marcus with visible nervousness but also determination. "Marcus, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. I've seen photos in Mr. Wright's office, and I believe this actually is Mrs. Wright. Maybe we should check with him before this goes any further." Her attempt at intervention was brave given the power dynamics involved. A junior server questioning a senior manager in front of guests and during an active confrontation, but it was also an acknowledgement that something had gone terribly wrong and needed correction before becoming irrevocable. Marcus turned on Jessica with visible irritation. "This doesn't concern you, and you need to get back to your section immediately. I don't need assistance from servers to handle front-of-house management, and your interference is completely inappropriate. Go take care of your tables and let me handle this situation." But Jessica didn't back down, her conviction apparently stronger than her fear of professional consequences. "Marcus, I'm serious. I really think you should verify this before calling security. If this is actually Mrs. Wright and we have her removed from the premises, Mr. Wright is going to be absolutely furious and we'll all be dealing with the fallout. Just take 2 minutes to check, please." Her insistence finally seemed to penetrate Marcus's wall of defensive certainty, and he reached for his tablet with visible reluctance, scrolling through reservations with movements that were deliberately slow, as if he could somehow delay the moment of reckoning he must have sensed was approaching. His finger stopped on a reservation entry, His face went pale, and the blood visibly drained from his features as recognition of his catastrophic mistake began to dawn. "Oh God," he whispered, so quietly that Elena almost didn't hear it. "Oh my God, I thought you were..." His voice trailed off as he struggled to find words that could possibly explain or excuse what he'd just done. Helena stood perfectly still, her phone still recording, waiting to see how Marcus would handle this moment now that the truth was undeniable, and the consequences of his assumptions were staring him in the face. The restaurant had gone almost completely silent, conversations dying out as more diners became aware that something significant was unfolding, that this wasn't just ordinary dinner theater, but something with real stakes and real implications that extended far beyond this single evening. Marcus looked at Elena with an expression that mixed horror, shame, and desperate hope for forgiveness that she had absolutely no obligation or inclination to provide. "Mrs. Wright, I apologize. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. If you'll please follow me to your table, I'll make sure everything is perfect for your anniversary dinner. We have your preferred champagne chilled, and Chef Rodriguez has prepared the special tasting menu exactly as Mr. Wright requested. Please let me escort you to your table and make this right." The apology was inadequate and the offer insulting, as if being seated at her reserved table after being publicly humiliated and threatened with arrest could somehow make things right or erase what had just happened in full view of dozens of witnesses. Elena looked at Marcus without speaking for a long moment, letting him sit with the discomfort of his actions and the weight of waiting to discover how she would respond to his belated attempt at service recovery. "Marcus, you weren't concerned about verifying my identity or checking reservations when you decided I didn't belong here. You made assumptions about who I could and couldn't be based entirely on my appearance, and you threatened me with police involvement, rather than taking 30 seconds to confirm information I'd provided from the beginning. Now that you've discovered I am exactly who I said I was, now that you understand I have the power to affect your employment and this establishment's reputation, suddenly you're apologetic and eager to provide excellent service. That's not how respect works, and it's certainly not how my husband and I expect the staff at this restaurant to treat any guest, regardless of their connection to ownership." Before Marcus could formulate a response, David Wright emerged from the kitchen where he'd been consulting with the chef about the anniversary menu he'd planned specifically for Elena's arrival. He was a tall white man in his mid-40s, his chef's coat traded for an elegant suit for this special evening, his face lit with anticipation that began to fade the moment he registered the scene unfolding in his restaurant's entrance area, his wife standing with her phone recording, his head waiter looking panicked and pale, other diners watching with rapt attention, and an atmosphere of tension that was completely wrong for what should have been a perfect romantic evening. "Elena, what's going on?" David asked, moving quickly toward his wife with concern evident in his voice and expression. "Is everything all right? Marcus, why is my wife standing here in the entrance instead of being seated at our table?" The questions were directed at both of them, but his eyes were fixed on Elena's face, reading the barely controlled anger there and beginning to understand that something had gone very, very wrong. Have you ever been in a space where someone made you feel like you didn't belong? Where you had to prove your right to be there? Did anyone step up to support you, or did you face it alone? Drop your story below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us realize we're not crazy for feeling hurt by what others dismiss as misunderstandings. Elena looked at her husband, and in that moment all the carefully controlled composure she'd maintained throughout Marcus's aggressive confrontation finally cracked, not into tears, but into the kind of cold fury that was somehow more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. "David, your head waiter just spent the last 10 minutes telling me I don't belong in the VIP section of your restaurant, refusing to check the reservation that has my name on it, threatening to call the police to have me arrested for trespassing, and explicitly stating that he knows for a fact that your wife is not someone who looks like me. I've recorded the entire encounter because without video evidence, these stories are always dismissed as exaggeration or oversensitivity. Would you like to hear exactly what was said to me in your establishment on our anniversary, while I was trying to surprise you with a gift I've been planning for months?" Her voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of hurt beneath the anger. Not just hurt from Marcus's treatment, but hurt that this was happening in a space her husband had created, a place that should have been safe and welcoming, that instead had become another venue where she had to defend her basic right to exist without harassment. David's face transformed from confusion to absolute fury as Elena's words registered, and he turned to Marcus with an expression that promised immediate and severe consequences. "You did what?" His voice was quiet but deadly, the kind of controlled rage that was far more frightening than yelling. "You threatened to have my wife arrested? You told her she doesn't belong here? You refused to verify a reservation because you decided based on looking at her that she couldn't possibly be who she said she was?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to explain or defend or minimize, but David held up one hand in a gesture that silenced him completely. Don't say anything right now, because whatever comes out of your mouth is only going to make this worse. Elena, I am so incredibly sorry. This should never have happened, and I'm horrified and ashamed that it happened in my restaurant by someone I trusted to represent my values and treat every guest with respect and dignity. He turned to address the dining room, which had gone completely silent as everyone watched this confrontation unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. What you've witnessed is completely unacceptable behavior that does not reflect the standards or values of this establishment, and it will be addressed immediately and comprehensively." Jessica Chen, the young server who'd tried to intervene earlier, approached David with visible nervousness but also determination to ensure he understood the full scope of what had occurred. "Mr. Wright, I tried to tell Marcus that I thought this was Mrs. Wright, that he should verify before escalating further, but he told me to mind my own business and threatened to write me up for interfering with management decisions. I'm sorry I didn't do more to stop this, but I want you to know that several of us were uncomfortable with how this was being handled and tried to speak up." David nodded acknowledgement to Jessica, his appreciation for her attempted intervention evident even as his primary focus remained on Elena and the damage that had been done. "Jessica, thank you for trying to help. I want you to write up a detailed account of everything you witnessed and email it to me directly. Your willingness to speak up even when it put you at professional risk is exactly the kind of integrity we need more of in this establishment." Marcus had recovered enough to attempt damage control, his voice taking on a pleading quality that revealed how thoroughly he understood the precariousness of his employment situation. "Mr. Wright, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. I was simply trying to maintain security protocols for the VIP section, and in the confusion I made some poor judgment calls that I deeply regret. Mrs. Wright, I'm truly sorry for any offense or inconvenience my actions caused. It was never my intention to make you feel unwelcome or disrespected. Please understand that I take my responsibilities seriously, and sometimes that means being cautious about access to restricted areas, but clearly I should have verified information more thoroughly before drawing conclusions. If you'll both give me an opportunity to make this right, I promise nothing like this will ever happen again." The apology was textbook crisis management. Acknowledge wrongdoing without accepting full responsibility. Frame it as misunderstanding rather than prejudice. Promise future improvement while minimizing the severity of what had actually occurred. Elena had heard variations of this speech countless times before, and she wasn't interested in accepting hollow apologies designed primarily to protect the apologizer, rather than acknowledge the real harm caused. "Marcus, this wasn't a misunderstanding or poor judgment," Elena said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "This was racial profiling, pure and simple. You saw a black woman approaching your VIP section, and you immediately assumed I was trying to gain access to somewhere I didn't belong. You didn't ask polite questions about my reservation. You blocked my path physically, you spoke to me with contempt from the very first words, and you escalated to threats of police involvement without ever taking the basic step of checking whether my claim was legitimate. And when Jessica tried to intervene with information that might have prevented this entire incident, you shut her down, because your assumptions were more important to you than actual facts. That's not security protocol, that's bias. And it's exactly the kind of bias that makes restaurants and hotels and stores and airports exhausting battlegrounds for people of color who have to constantly prove their right to occupy spaces that white people access without question or challenge." She turned to David, her expression softening slightly as she addressed her husband rather than his employee. "David, I love you and I appreciate everything you were trying to do to make tonight special for our anniversary. But I can't stay here and enjoy a romantic dinner after being publicly humiliated and threatened in your restaurant. This has poisoned the entire evening and I need some time to process what just happened before I can even think about celebrating." David's face reflected devastation and fury in equal measure. Devastation at his wife's pain and the ruining of their carefully planned anniversary. fury at Marcus for causing this situation, and for revealing that Meridian clearly had serious problems with staff training and institutional bias that David had failed to recognize or address adequately. Elena, I completely understand and I support whatever you need right now. But please know that this is not over, that Marcus's employment here has ended as of this moment, and that I'm going to be conducting a comprehensive review of our hiring practices, training protocols, and staff attitudes to ensure nothing like this happens again to you or anyone else who walks through these doors. Marcus, you're fired. Effective immediately. Remove your personal items from the staff area and leave the premises. Someone from HR will contact you about final paycheck and benefits paperwork, but your time working at this restaurant is finished. The termination was swift and decisive. No performance improvement plans or second chances, just immediate consequences for behavior that David clearly found indefensible and incompatible with his vision for his establishment. Marcus's face went pale again, clearly not having expected such immediate and severe consequences despite the obvious severity of his actions. Mr. Wright, please, you can't fire me over one mistake. I've worked here for 3 years. My performance reviews have always been excellent. I've helped build this restaurant's reputation for service excellence. Surely this situation warrants a conversation about additional training or a formal warning, not immediate termination. I have a family to support, a mortgage to pay, responsibilities that require steady employment. Please reconsider this decision. Give me a chance to make amends and prove I can do better. The pleading was desperate but also tone-deaf, asking the man whose wife he'd just humiliated and threatened for leniency and second chances, framing his financial concerns as if they somehow outweighed the harm he'd caused or the liability he represented for the business. David's expression hardened further at Marcus's self-centered appeal. Marcus, you threatened to have my wife arrested on our anniversary for the crime of being a black woman who dared to claim access to a space you'd decided she didn't belong in. You ignored information from staff that might have prevented this escalation, because your assumptions were more important than facts. You made this restaurant, my restaurant, the business I've built from nothing, a place where people of color are treated with suspicion and hostility rather than welcome and respect. Those aren't mistakes that warrant additional training. Those are fundamental failures of character and judgment that make you unsuitable for any position representing this establishment. Your 3 years of otherwise good performance don't excuse or erase what happened tonight. Now leave before I have security escort you out, which would be deeply ironic given that you were threatening to do exactly that to my wife 20 minutes ago. The threat of security escort apparently penetrated where moral arguments hadn't, and Marcus turned toward the staff area to collect his belongings, but not before making one final attempt at shifting blame and minimizing responsibility. Mrs. Wright, I hope you understand that I was simply doing my job as I've been trained to do it. If there are problems with our protocols or our approach to security, those are institutional issues that go beyond my personal actions. I'm sorry you felt disrespected, but my intentions were never malicious. I was trying to protect the establishment and its guests. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive what was essentially a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Elena felt rage surge fresh at Marcus's continued refusal to take real responsibility. His characterization of blatant racial profiling as doing my job. His suggestion that she'd merely felt disrespected rather than acknowledging that she had been genuinely disrespected through his actions. Marcus, stop talking and leave now, David ordered before Elena could respond. Every word out of your mouth is making this worse and exposing more clearly why you need to be nowhere near this restaurant or any customer-facing role. Go. Now. As Marcus finally retreated toward the staff area, the restaurant remained in stunned silence, diners processing what they'd witnessed and uncertain how to respond to the dramatic confrontation and its equally dramatic resolution. An older white couple at a nearby table stood and approached David and Elena, the woman's face reflecting genuine concern and sympathy. Mrs. Wright, we couldn't help but overhear what happened, and we wanted you to know that what that man did to you was completely wrong and inexcusable. We're so sorry you had to experience that, especially on what should have been a special evening for you and your husband. For what it's worth, we've been watching you handle that situation with remarkable grace and dignity, and we admire your composure in circumstances where most people would have lost their temper entirely. Her husband nodded agreement. We're both retired educators, and we spent careers trying to teach young people about respect and dignity, for all people regardless of their backgrounds. It's disheartening to see that apparently those lessons haven't penetrated as thoroughly as we'd hoped, that someone can work in a diverse city in supposedly enlightened times and still harbor such obvious prejudices. Thank you for standing up for yourself and for holding this establishment accountable. That took courage and it matters. Elena thanked them for their support, genuinely appreciating the solidarity even as she recognized that white witnesses expressing sympathy after the fact, while valuable, didn't prevent the incidents from occurring or protect people of color from the daily indignities of navigating spaces where their belonging was constantly questioned. Other diners approached with similar expressions of support, some sharing their own stories of witnessing or experiencing discrimination, others simply wanting to acknowledge the wrong that had been done and express hope that Elena would be all right, despite the trauma of the evening. David stood beside his wife throughout these interactions, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of support and protection that came too late to shield her from Marcus's behavior, but perhaps offered some comfort in its aftermath. Jessica Chen reappeared with a handwritten note that she gave directly to Elena. Mrs. Wright, I wrote down everything I witnessed in case you need additional documentation beyond your video. I included the exact quotes I remember, the timeline of events, and the names of other staff and guests who were present and can corroborate what happened. I also want you to know that several of us on staff have been uncomfortable with some of Marcus's attitudes and comments for a while, but we didn't know how to report concerns about a manager without risking our own jobs. I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner. Maybe if we had, tonight wouldn't have happened. Elena read the note quickly, appreciating Jessica's thoroughness and her willingness to provide documented testimony, even though Marcus had already been fired and presumably couldn't retaliate against her now. Jessica, thank you for this, and for trying to intervene earlier even when it put you at risk. You're right that speaking up sooner about concerns with Marcus's attitudes might have prevented tonight, but I also understand how difficult it is to challenge supervisors, especially when you're young and need your job and aren't sure anyone will believe you or support you. The fact that you tried to stop it once it was happening shows character, and I appreciate that more than you probably realize. She turned to David, exhaustion and hurt finally breaking through the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation. David, I need to go home. I can't be here anymore tonight. I know you had this whole evening planned and I'm sorry it's ruined, but I just need space to process what happened and I can't do that surrounded by people and cameras and well-meaning strangers, offering sympathy for something that shouldn't have occurred in the first place. David nodded, understanding, his own disappointment at the ruined anniversary clearly secondary to his concern for Elena's well-being and his determination to support whatever she needed. Of course. Let me get your coat, and we'll leave right now. The anniversary can wait. What matters is you and making sure you're okay after going through something that never should have happened, and that I failed to prevent by not creating a culture here that made this kind of behavior impossible. He turned to address the dining room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, again I apologize for the disruption to your evening. Your meals tonight are complimentary with my sincere thanks for your patience and understanding. Jessica will be acting as front-of-house manager for the remainder of the evening, and if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask her or any member of our staff. Thank you for your continued patronage, and for the many expressions of support you've offered to my wife. That kindness means more than I can adequately express. As he helped Elena into her coat, David's phone began buzzing with notifications. Apparently, someone in the dining room had shared Elena's video on social media, and it was already beginning to circulate with the speed and reach that characterized viral content in the age of smartphones and instant digital sharing. The video would be viewed over 8 million times in the next 48 hours, shared across every social media platform with commentary ranging from outrage at Marcus's behavior to appreciation for David's swift response to broader conversations about racism in service industries, and the exhausting reality of being black in spaces that treated your presence as suspicious rather than ordinary. But in that moment, as David and Elena walked out of Meridian Fine Dining with their anniversary celebration ruined but their partnership intact, the viral potential of the video was secondary to the immediate need to get somewhere safe and private, where Elena could finally let down the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the entire traumatic encounter. They drove home in silence, David reaching over to hold Elena's hand while she stared out the window processing everything that had happened, both of them understanding that this evening would mark their 15th anniversary, more indelibly than any romantic dinner could have, but for all the wrong reasons that would require time and work, and difficult conversations to process and heal from. The video of Elena Wright being confronted at Meridian Fine Dining exploded across social media platforms faster than David or Elena could have anticipated, amplified by prominent accounts focused on racial justice, shared widely within Black communities, who recognized the experience as painfully familiar, and picked up quickly by local news outlets that recognized both the dramatic nature of the confrontation and its broader implications about persistent racism despite decades of supposed progress. By the following morning, Meridian Restaurant was trending nationally on Twitter. David's business phone was flooded with media inquiries, and Elena's personal social media accounts were overwhelmed with messages of support from strangers who'd seen the video and wanted to express solidarity with her experience. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable. Elena had recorded the incident for documentation and accountability purposes, not because she'd wanted to become a viral sensation or the public face of yet another conversation about racism in America. But the video had taken on a life of its own, and now she was facing decisions about how to respond to the attention, whether to give interviews, and what role she wanted to play in the broader conversations her experience had sparked. David had spent much of the night lying awake, replaying the incident in his mind, analyzing where his systems and training had failed, questioning how Marcus had worked for 3 years, exhibiting excellent performance in most areas, while harboring the kind of racial bias that had exploded so catastrophically onto Elena. He'd reviewed Marcus's employment file, read through past performance reviews that had all been positive with no indications of problems with judgment or professionalism, examined the training protocols new employees went through that supposedly covered inclusivity and respectful treatment of all guests. Everything had looked fine on paper, which meant the failure was deeper than just one person's prejudice. It was systemic, cultural, embedded in assumptions and practices that David hadn't recognized or adequately addressed because his own white privilege had insulated him from experiencing the kind of discrimination Elena navigated routinely. The realization was painful and humbling, forcing him to confront his own blindness and the ways he'd failed to create the kind of truly inclusive environment he'd believed Meridian represented. By mid-morning, David's restaurant was surrounded by news crews seeking interviews and by protesters who'd organized overnight to demand accountability, not just from Meridian, but from the broader restaurant industry that regularly subjected Black patrons and Black employees to differential treatment based on race. The protesters carried signs reading, "Dining while Black shouldn't be dangerous," "Fine dining for everyone," and "Your racism is showing," their presence drawing additional media attention and making clear that this incident wasn't going to fade quietly despite David's swift termination of Marcus. Community organizers were demanding a public meeting where David would have to answer questions about his hiring practices, his training protocols, and his plans for ensuring nothing like this happened again. Several other Black women had come forward on social media sharing their own experiences of discrimination at Meridian and other upscale restaurants, being seated near kitchens or bathrooms despite reservations for better tables, receiving noticeably slower or less attentive service than white diners, being questioned about their ability to pay before being allowed to order expensive items, facing skeptical treatment when using credit cards or trying to split checks in ways that white patrons never encountered. Elena read through these stories with a mixture of validation and devastation. Validation because they confirmed her experience wasn't isolated or unique. Devastation because they revealed that Meridian under David's ownership had been the site of multiple discriminatory incidents that he'd either been unaware of or had failed to address adequately. "David, we need to talk about these other women's stories," Elena said when her husband emerged from his office where he'd been dealing with the crisis all morning. This wasn't just Marcus being terrible. This was a pattern of behavior that multiple Black women experienced at your restaurant, which means the problem is deeper than one racist employee. It means there's a culture problem that allowed this behavior to persist and even thrive. We need to address that honestly if we're going to fix anything. David sat down heavily, his face reflecting the weight of discovering that his business had been causing harm he'd been oblivious to. "I've been reading those stories too, and I'm sick about it. I genuinely believed we were creating an inclusive environment, that we treated everyone equally, that we had good people working here who shared my values. Clearly I was wrong, and clearly my belief in our inclusivity was based on not paying attention to experiences that people of color were having, that I wasn't seeing or hearing about. because nobody felt comfortable reporting them to me. The conversation that followed was difficult and honest, with Elena sharing experiences she'd had at other establishments that she'd never detailed fully to David before, because recounting every instance of discrimination was exhausting and often felt pointless, when the pattern was so pervasive and unchanging. She described the hypervigilance required when entering predominantly white spaces, the mental calculations about whether to speak up when receiving poor treatment, or just accept it to avoid conflict, the burden of constantly having to prove your legitimacy and right to occupy space that white people took for granted. David listened with growing horror and shame, realizing how much of Elena's daily reality he'd been insulated from by his own white privilege, how many experiences she'd navigated alone or minimized in sharing because she didn't want to burden him, or because she'd learned that white people, even well-meaning ones like her husband, often became defensive or dismissive when confronted with accounts of racism they hadn't personally witnessed. "I'm so sorry," David said when Elena finished. "I'm sorry for what Marcus did to you, but I'm even more sorry that I created an environment where he felt comfortable doing it, where other staff apparently saw problematic behavior from him and didn't feel safe reporting it, where other Black guests had negative experiences that never reached me because our complaint systems weren't designed to surface this kind of discrimination effectively." By afternoon, David had scheduled the public meeting that community organizers were demanding, renting a large community center space that could accommodate the expected crowd and ensuring adequate sound system and accessibility features. He'd also hired Dr. Patricia Morrison, a consultant specializing in anti-racism work and organizational transformation, to conduct a comprehensive audit of Meridian's practices and to help develop meaningful changes rather than superficial responses designed primarily for public relations purposes. Dr. Morrison was a Black woman in her late 50s with decades of experience working with businesses and institutions that had experienced racial incidents and wanted to pursue genuine transformation, and she had a reputation for being direct and uncompromising in her assessments rather than telling clients what they wanted to hear. Her first meeting with David and Elena was scheduled for that evening before the community forum, and she'd made clear that she expected complete access to employee files, customer complaint records, and honest conversations with staff about their experiences and observations, even if those conversations revealed uncomfortable truths about the business David had built. Jessica Chen had been working with several other staff members to document concerns they'd had about Marcus and about broader patterns at Meridian that made people of color, both guests and employees, feel less welcome than white counterparts. The document they produced was detailed and damning, describing Marcus's tendency to assign Black and Latino staff to less visible or less desirable sections, his skeptical treatment of non-white guests making reservations or inquiries about private events, his casual comments about certain neighborhoods or client types that revealed racial stereotyping, even when he didn't use explicitly racist language. It also described experiences of Latino kitchen staff who felt excluded from opportunities for advancement into front-of-house positions despite their culinary skills and customer service aptitude, Asian employees who faced assumptions about their roles based on stereotypes about Asian workers in restaurant industries, and Black employees who reported being held to different standards than white colleagues for appearance, punctuality, and interpersonal interactions with guests. The systemic nature of the problems was undeniable, and Jessica felt both relieved and anxious about bringing these issues to light. Relieved because they needed to be addressed, anxious because she worried about retaliation or being labeled a troublemaker despite David's apparent commitment to change. The community forum that evening drew over 200 people, filling the community center to capacity with additional attendees watching via live stream that had been set up to ensure maximum transparency and public accountability. The crowd was diverse. Black community members who'd experienced discrimination at Meridian and other establishments, white allies who wanted to support the push for change, restaurant industry workers from across the city who recognized that these problems extended far beyond one business, activists who'd been organizing around racial justice issues for years, and media representatives documenting everything for their outlets. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, anger at what had happened to Elena and others, skepticism about whether this moment would lead to real change or just performative gestures, hope that maybe this time the combination of viral video, swift consequences, and sustained pressure might actually produce meaningful transformation rather than temporary adjustments that would fade once attention moved elsewhere. David stood at the front of the room with Elena beside him, Dr. Morrison on his other side, and Jessica Chen sitting with other Meridian staff members in the front rows ready to provide testimony if needed. "Thank you all for coming tonight," David began, his voice carrying across the room through the sound system. "I'm not here to make excuses or to minimize what happened to my wife at my restaurant 2 nights ago. I'm here to listen, to learn, to take accountability for failures that went far beyond one employee's actions, and to commit publicly to transformation that will make Meridian, and hopefully other establishments, truly inclusive spaces, rather than places where people of color have to constantly prove their right to be present and to receive respectful service. What happened to Elena was wrong, inexcusable, and a direct result of systemic failures in my hiring, training, and oversight that I didn't recognize or address because my own privilege insulated me from experiencing or even noticing the discrimination that was happening regularly under my watch. I fired Marcus Bennett immediately because his behavior was indefensible, but firing one person doesn't solve institutional problems, and I understand that real change requires much more than removing one bad actor." Before David could continue, a woman stood from the audience, her expression reflecting years of accumulated frustration, finally finding an outlet for expression. "Mr. Wright, I appreciate that you fired the employee who humiliated your wife, but where was this swift justice when I complained 6 months ago about being seated next to the kitchen despite having a reservation and watching white couples who arrived after me get seated at prime tables? I was told those tables were reserved even though I could see them sitting empty for the next hour. I was told I was being oversensitive when I suggested there might be a pattern to who gets good tables and who gets stuck in undesirable locations. My complaint was dismissed, and apparently nothing changed because your wife experienced the same kind of discrimination that I and others have been experiencing for months or years. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about your sudden commitment to change now that it's personal and public and affecting your reputation." Her words were met with applause and vocal agreement from many others in the room, who recognized their own experiences in her account. David absorbed the criticism without defensiveness, understanding that he'd earned the skepticism and that defensiveness would only make things worse. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize for failing to take your complaint seriously when you brought it to my attention. I don't have a good excuse for that failure except that I wasn't paying adequate attention to patterns. I wasn't creating systems that made it easy or safe to report discrimination, and I wasn't sufficiently educated about how racism operates in service industries to recognize it, even when it was described directly to me. That's on me, not on you or anyone else who experienced mistreatment and tried to report it only to be dismissed or ignored. I can't undo those failures, but I can commit to doing better going forward, and to creating accountability systems that will make it impossible for complaints to be dismissed the way yours was." He paused, looking around the room. "I want to invite anyone who's experienced discrimination at Meridian to come forward, either publicly tonight or privately through Dr. Morrison's audit process. Your stories matter. They deserve to be heard and addressed, and I want to understand the full scope of the problems so we can address them comprehensively, rather than just treating symptoms." Dr. Patricia Morrison stood to address the crowd, her presence commanding immediate attention and respect. "I'm Dr. Patricia Morrison, and I've been hired to conduct an independent audit of Meridian's practices with full access to records, staff, and operational systems. I want to be very clear with everyone here. My job is not to protect Mr. Wright's reputation or to make this go away quietly. My job is to identify systemic problems, recommend concrete solutions, and hold this organization accountable for implementing changes that will actually transform culture, rather than just create better public relations. I've done this work for 30 years, and I've seen every possible response from organizations that experience racial incidents. Some are genuinely committed to change and willing to do the difficult work required. Others just want the negative attention to stop and will make minimal adjustments while hoping the scrutiny fades. My preliminary assessment after spending today reviewing Meridian's operations is that there are significant systemic problems that go beyond one employee's actions. But I've also seen some encouraging signs. Staff members who've been documenting concerns and are ready to speak honestly about needed changes, an owner who seems genuinely shaken by discovering how much harm his business has caused, and community members who are organized and determined to maintain pressure for real transformation. Whether that translates into meaningful change will depend on sustained effort and accountability over months and years. not just the next few weeks while media attention is focused here. Elena stepped forward, her first public comments since the video had gone viral, drawing immediate attention and respectful silence from the crowd. I want to thank everyone who's reached out with support and who's shared their own stories of discrimination in restaurants and other public spaces. Your stories have been painful to read but also validating. They confirm that what I experienced wasn't unique or isolated, that this is a pattern affecting Black people and other people of color constantly in ways that white people often don't see or acknowledge. I also want to be honest about something difficult. I'm married to a white man who owns a successful restaurant, which gives me certain privileges and protections that many of you don't have. When Marcus Bennett was threatening to have me arrested, I could invoke my connection to ownership to eventually stop the situation. Many of you can't do that, and you experience similar treatment without any recourse or protection, or even belief when you report what happened. That's the reality we need to change. Not just making sure people connected to ownership are treated respectfully, but ensuring that every person who walks into any establishment receives respect and dignity, regardless of their race, their appearance, their economic status, or any other factor that should be irrelevant to how they're treated. A young Black woman stood, her voice shaking with emotion but determined to be heard. Mrs. Wright, thank you for saying that about privilege and protection, because I think that's something that gets overlooked in these conversations. I work at a retail store downtown, and I get followed by security almost every shift, even though I'm an employee with a name tag and employee discount card. When I complained to my manager, she told me that security follows people who match certain profiles, and that I shouldn't take it personally. But it is personal when you're constantly treated like a criminal just for existing in your own workplace. The difference is I can't get my manager fired when he dismisses my complaints. I don't have an owner spouse who will take swift action to protect me. And if I push too hard, I'll probably lose my job rather than seeing any real change. So while I appreciate that you're using your platform to highlight these issues, I also want to make sure we're talking about solutions that help all of us, not just people with connections or resources, to fight back effectively. Her comments drew sustained applause and several people standing in solidarity, acknowledging the class dimensions that intersected with racial discrimination to create even more vulnerability for people without economic security or institutional power. Jessica Chen stood at David's invitation to share what staff members had documented about patterns at Meridian. Her nervousness evident, but her commitment to honesty stronger than her fear. Mr. Wright asked me and other staff to document concerns we've had about discrimination at Meridian, and what we found was honestly shocking, even though we'd all witnessed various pieces of it. We found that Black guests were significantly more likely to be questioned about reservations than white guests, more likely to have credit cards subjected to additional verification, more likely to experience delays in service even when the restaurant wasn't particularly busy. We found that employees of color were disproportionately assigned to less desirable shifts or sections, were held to stricter standards about appearance and punctuality than white employees, and faced more scrutiny when they made mistakes that white employees routinely made without consequence. And we found that several staff members had raised concerns about Marcus Bennett's attitudes and behavior over the past 2 years, but those concerns were either dismissed as personality conflicts or never made it to Mr. Wright's attention because our complaint systems weren't designed to surface this kind of information effectively. She paused, her voice strengthening. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to destroy Meridian or get more people fired. I'm trying to make it a place where I'm proud to work, where I don't have to watch guests and colleagues being treated unfairly and feel helpless to do anything about it. Mr. Wright has always been a fair and respectful employer to me personally, which is why I believe he can lead the changes we need if he commits to really hearing what we're telling him and acting on it consistently, rather than just addressing the most visible problems. The forum continued for over 3 hours, with story after story of discrimination experienced at Meridian and other establishments, discussions about what meaningful change would actually require, skeptical questions about whether this moment would be different from past incidents that generated temporary attention but little lasting transformation, and concrete demands that community organizations presented to David about accountability measures, ongoing transparency, and sustained engagement rather than just reforms implemented behind closed doors. Throughout it all, David listened more than he spoke, taking notes, asking clarifying questions when he didn't understand something, and resisting the defensive impulses that arose when people criticized not just his restaurant, but his own failures to recognize and address problems that had been happening under his watch. Elena sat beside him offering support, but also adding her own voice when discussions veered toward minimizing the experiences people of color faced, or when suggested solutions seemed inadequate to address the scope of systemic problems being described. By the end of the evening, David had committed publicly to a series of specific actions: comprehensive anti-racism training for all staff developed and delivered by experts in the field rather than generic diversity consultants, revision of hiring and promotion practices to address disparities in who got hired into which positions and who advanced within the organization, implementation of a robust complaint system that made it safe and effective to report discrimination, whether you were a guest or an employee, regular audits of service patterns to identify disparities that staff might not recognize or report, creation of an advisory board including community members and employees of color, who would have access to operational data and authority to raise concerns directly to ownership, and most significantly, a commitment to ongoing transparency through quarterly public reports on progress toward stated goals. The commitments were recorded, distributed in written form to all attendees, and posted on Meridian's website and social media accounts so they could be referenced and enforced by people determined to maintain accountability. "I know trust has to be earned and that promises are easy to make but harder to keep," David said in his closing remarks. "I'm asking for the opportunity to demonstrate through actions that I'm serious about transformation rather than just damage control, but I'm also acknowledging that you have every reason to be skeptical, that I've already failed you and others who've experienced discrimination at my establishment, and that it's on me to prove my commitment through sustained effort rather than expecting credit for good intentions. Thank you for your honesty tonight, for your willingness to share painful experiences, and for holding me and Meridian accountable for being better than we've been. I hope you'll continue to engage with this process, to demand transparency, and to call me out if I'm failing to follow through on the commitments I've made here tonight." The response was mixed. Some applause for his willingness to listen and commit publicly. Some skepticism expressed vocally about whether talk would translate to action. General agreement that the proof would be in long-term follow-through rather than immediate response to crisis. 2 months after the viral video that had turned Elena Wright's anniversary into a national conversation about racism in service industries, Meridian Fine Dining had undergone transformations that were both visible and invisible to casual observers. The most obvious changes were cosmetic. New mission statements posted prominently near the entrance, articulating commitment to inclusive excellence. Photographs displayed throughout the restaurant showcasing diverse staff and diverse clientele. Menus redesigned to highlight contributions from all members of the culinary team, rather than just the head chef. But the more significant changes were operational and cultural. Revised hiring processes that involved diverse interview panels and blind resume reviews to reduce bias in candidate selection. Compensation audits that had revealed and corrected pay disparities between employees of similar experience and responsibility levels. Revised training programs that addressed implicit bias and provided staff with tools to recognize and interrupt discrimination when they witnessed it. Implementation of a robust complaint system where reports were tracked independently and patterns analyzed quarterly to identify problems before they reached crisis level. Dr. Patricia Morrison had delivered her comprehensive audit report 3 weeks earlier, and it had been sobering reading for David and anyone who'd believed that Meridian's problems began and ended with Marcus Bennett. The report documented systemic patterns of differential treatment spanning years. Black guests waiting an average of 12 minutes longer for service than white guests even when controlling for reservation times and restaurant capacity. People of color being seated at less desirable tables 68% of the time when the restaurant was at capacity, despite no articulated policy creating this disparity. Staff of color being promoted at significantly lower rates than white staff, with comparable performance reviews and tenure. The report also identified cultural factors that enabled these disparities, an emphasis on cultural fit in hiring that often translated into preference for candidates who resembled existing staff, informal complaint processes that relied on employees feeling comfortable approaching managers who might themselves be part of the problem, lack of diversity in leadership positions that made it difficult for staff and guests of color to see themselves reflected in the organization's power structure, inadequate training on recognizing and addressing bias that left well-intentioned employees without tools to interrupt discrimination they might witness. The response to Dr. Morrison's report had required difficult decisions and uncomfortable conversations. David had restructured his management team, promoting Jessica Chen to a newly created position of Director of Inclusive Excellence, with authority to review operational decisions and intervene when she identified practices that created disparate impacts. He'd implemented anonymous quarterly staff surveys that asked specifically about experiences with discrimination and collected demographic data to identify whether different groups were having systematically different experiences. He'd revised compensation structures to ensure transparency and equity, publishing salary ranges for all positions and requiring documented justification for any variations within those ranges. And perhaps most significantly, he'd acknowledged publicly through a detailed statement on Meridian's website and social media that the problems Dr. Morrison had identified represented failures of his leadership and oversight, taking personal responsibility rather than attributing everything to a few problematic employees who'd somehow slipped through his hiring processes. Elena had been intimately involved in these transformation efforts, using her experience as both victim of discrimination and as someone with intimate knowledge of Meridian's operations through her relationship with David. She'd worked with Dr. Morrison to develop training materials that went beyond generic diversity concepts to address the specific ways bias manifested in fine dining contexts, assumptions about who could afford expensive meals, stereotypes about appropriate appearance for upscale establishments, coded language about maintaining standards that often masked racial exclusion. She'd also been instrumental in developing the complaint system, drawing on her research background in public health to design data collection and analysis tools that would surface patterns rather than just addressing individual incidents in isolation. The work had been emotionally draining, requiring her to revisit her own traumatic experience repeatedly, while also hearing countless other stories of discrimination that revealed just how pervasive these problems were across the restaurant industry and beyond. Marcus Bennett had attempted multiple times to contact David, requesting meetings to discuss wrongful termination claims and demanding severance packages beyond what he was legally entitled to receive. His lawyer had sent threatening letters suggesting that Marcus's firing had been precipitous and unsupported by adequate documentation of policy violations, conveniently ignoring the video evidence and witness testimony that made his actions undeniable. David had refused all meeting requests, referred all legal communication to Meridian's attorney, and maintained the position that Marcus's termination was justified based on behavior that was both morally wrong and legally problematic, given that it exposed the restaurant to discrimination liability. Marcus had also attempted to control the narrative on social media, posting his own version of events that portrayed him as a conscientious employee who'd been scapegoated to protect the restaurant's reputation, claiming he'd been following security protocols, and suggesting that Elena had been aggressive and difficult in ways the video somehow didn't capture. His posts had been met with overwhelming criticism and detailed rebuttals from people who'd seen the full video and recognized his statements as self-serving distortions rather than honest accounting. The advisory board that David had committed to creating during the community forum had held its first official meeting the previous week, bringing together community activists, current and former Meridian employees, representatives from civil rights organizations, and independent restaurant industry professionals to review progress on stated goals and to provide guidance on ongoing transformation efforts. The meeting had been productive, but also challenging, with board members pushing back against some of David's proposed timelines as too slow and some of his metrics for success as insufficiently ambitious. Mr. Wright, we appreciate the changes you've implemented, but we need to be honest about something, Martha Williams, who'd been appointed board chair, had said during the meeting. These reforms are good starting points, but they're not sufficient endpoints. Real transformation means fundamentally rethinking how your business operates, who it serves, who it employs in positions of power and influence, and how success is measured. If we're just trying to get back to business as usual with slightly better training and complaint processes, we're missing the opportunity to reimagine what an actually inclusive fine dining establishment could look like. Her comments had sparked extended discussion about what truly inclusive excellence might require, not just ensuring that people of color could access Meridian without experiencing discrimination, but actively working to dismantle the broader systems that made fine dining spaces predominantly white and economically exclusive. Some board members argued for expanded community engagement, including partnerships with neighborhood organizations, reduced-price community dinners that would make Meridian accessible to people who couldn't afford regular menu prices, scholarship programs to train aspiring chefs and restaurant professionals from underrepresented communities. Others pushed for Meridian to use its platform and David's industry connections to advocate for broader changes in how restaurants operated, challenging industry practices around tipping that often disadvantaged workers of color, pushing back against licensing and permit systems that created barriers to entry for entrepreneurs without existing capital and connections, supporting policy changes that would make discrimination complaints easier to file and enforce. The scope of what was being proposed went far beyond addressing internal operational problems to reimagining Meridian's role in its community and its industry. David had left that advisory board meeting feeling simultaneously energized by the possibilities being articulated and overwhelmed by the scope of work being described. "I opened a restaurant because I love food and hospitality and creating experiences that make people happy," he'd told Elena that night. "I didn't set out to become a civil rights activist or to take on systemic racism in the restaurant industry. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the right person to be leading this transformation, or if I should sell Meridian to someone who has lived experience with the discrimination we're trying to address and might be better positioned to create the kind of change people are demanding." Elena had listened to his doubts with sympathy, but also with challenge. "David, you don't get to opt out of this work just because it's difficult, or because you feel inadequate to the task. You created a business that caused harm to people of color, whether you intended that or not, which means you have responsibility to address that harm and to ensure it doesn't continue. And honestly, part of the work is white people with resources and platform using those advantages to push for changes that people of color have been advocating for, but haven't had the power to implement on their own. That's what being an ally actually means, not just expressing support, but using your privilege in service of justice even when it's uncomfortable or costly for you personally." The conversation had continued late into the night, touching on questions of responsibility, efficacy, sustainability, and the difference between performative allyship and genuine partnership in pursuit of racial justice. David had acknowledged that part of his resistance came from fear of failure, fear of saying or doing the wrong thing despite good intentions, fear of being perceived as trying to center himself in conversations that should be focused on people most affected by racism, fear of the financial costs if transformation efforts reduced Meridian's profitability or alienated customers who preferred the status quo. Elena had acknowledged those fears while also pushing him to recognize that fear of failure or discomfort couldn't be sufficient reason to avoid necessary work, that the costs to him of transformation were minimal compared to the costs people of color paid daily when navigating spaces that treated them as threats or intruders. "You're going to make mistakes," she told him. "You're going to say things that reveal blind spots. You're going to propose solutions that people with more experience in anti-racism work will point out are inadequate. You're going to feel defensive sometimes when criticized. That's all part of the learning process, and it's not a reason to give up or hand off responsibility to someone else. What matters is that you stay committed even when it's hard, that you listen when people tell you you're missing something, and that you keep showing up to do the work even when it's uncomfortable or unrewarding." 3 former Meridian employees had filed formal discrimination complaints with the State Human Rights Commission, describing patterns of treatment that aligned with what Dr. Morrison's audit had documented and what other current employees had shared during the transformation process. The complaints were being investigated independently, and David had committed to full cooperation, including providing requested documents and making employees available for interviews. His lawyer had advised fighting the complaints on procedural grounds or settling quickly with non-disclosure agreements that would prevent complainants from speaking publicly about their experiences, standard practice for businesses facing discrimination claims. David had rejected that advice, believing that transparency about past failures was necessary for building trust, and that attempting to silence people who'd experienced discrimination would undermine all the work Meridian was supposedly doing toward transformation. "These complaints are painful to read and they're going to be expensive to resolve, but they're also accurate descriptions of what was happening here," he'd told his legal team. "I'd rather acknowledge that honestly and take responsibility than try to hide behind legal technicalities or buy people's silence." That's not the kind of organization I want to run. The financial impacts of transformation were starting to manifest in ways David's accountant found concerning, but David believed were necessary investments in long-term sustainability and moral legitimacy. Revenue had declined approximately 18% since the viral video, partly from temporary negative publicity, but more significantly, from deliberate decisions to prioritize equity over maximum profitability, implementing higher base wages that reduced reliance on tips and narrowed pay disparities, investing in expanded training and professional development, especially for employees of color who'd historically had less access to advancement opportunities, allocating resources to the advisory board, and ongoing auditing processes, creating the Director of Inclusive Excellence position, and other structural changes that increased operational costs. Some longtime wealthy customers had stopped patronizing Meridian after the video went viral, either because they disapproved of David's response to the incident, or because they felt uncomfortable dining somewhere that had become associated with racism, even though David was actively working to address the problems. But other customers had increased their patronage specifically because they wanted to support a business that was taking accountability seriously and investing in transformation rather than just managing reputational damage. Elena had returned to Meridian for the first time since the incident 2 weeks earlier, at David's request to participate in a staff meeting where employees could ask questions directly about her experience and the transformation process. Walking back into the restaurant had been emotionally difficult, triggering visceral memories of Marcus Bennett blocking her path and threatening her with arrest, of feeling humiliated and powerless in a space her husband owned, of discovering that what she'd thought was an isolated incident was actually part of a pattern affecting numerous people over extended time. But she'd also felt determination to reclaim that space, to transform it from a site of trauma into a site of learning and growth, to use her experience as catalyst for changes that would benefit people she'd never meet. The staff meeting had been raw and honest, with employees of color sharing their own experiences of differential treatment and white employees acknowledging their blindness to patterns they'd witnessed, but never questioned. Jessica Chen had presented data on service timing and seating patterns that made disparities undeniable, even to staff who'd believed they treated everyone fairly, creating uncomfortable reckoning with the gap between intentions and impacts. "I want to be clear about something," Elena had told the assembled staff. "What Marcus Bennett did to me was wrong and it was racist. But he didn't create the conditions that made his behavior possible. Those conditions existed before he was hired, and they'll persist after his termination, unless we actively work to change them. Every person in this room has participated in systems that produce disparate outcomes, even if you never consciously decided to treat people differently based on race. And that means every person here has responsibility for being part of the solution, for interrupting bias when you see it, for questioning practices that seem neutral, but produce unequal results, for speaking up when complaints are dismissed or minimized. This isn't just David's work or management's work. It's everyone's work if we're serious about making Meridian a place where people of all backgrounds feel genuinely welcome and valued." Her words had resonated with staff at different levels depending on their own experiences and their readiness to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their workplace, but they'd set a tone for the kind of ongoing engagement and accountability that transformation would require. 6 months after Elena Wright's viral video had sparked national conversation and forced Meridian Fine Dining into painful but necessary transformation, the restaurant hosted its first community table dinner, a monthly event where neighborhood residents could enjoy a full tasting menu for $25, subsidized by full-price meals and by donors who'd rallied to support Meridian's inclusive vision after seeing David's commitment to substantive change. The inaugural dinner served 75 people from the surrounding neighborhoods, many of whom had never stepped foot in Meridian before because they'd assumed fine dining establishments weren't meant for people like them, whether due to economic constraints or implicit messages about who belonged in such spaces. Elena worked the event alongside David and the staff, greeting guests, explaining dishes, and engaging in conversations about food, community, and the ongoing work of building truly inclusive spaces that didn't just tolerate diversity, but actively celebrated it. The Community Table Initiative had emerged from advisory board discussions about how Meridian could demonstrate commitment to inclusive excellence beyond just avoiding discrimination. how it could actively work to dismantle barriers that made fine dining predominantly accessible to wealthy white clientele. The subsidized pricing made elegant cuisine available to people across economic spectrum. The family-style service created different atmosphere than the formal individual plating that could feel intimidating to people unfamiliar with fine dining conventions, and the deliberate community focus sent message that Meridian existed to serve its neighborhood, rather than just extracting resources from it. The response had exceeded expectations, with the first dinner selling out within hours of announced and a waiting list forming immediately for future events. Community members who attended shared the experience enthusiastically on social media, posting photos of beautifully plated dishes and expressing appreciation for being welcomed into a space they'd previously perceived as exclusive and unwelcoming. Dr. Patricia Morrison had continued working with Meridian on an ongoing basis, conducting quarterly audits to assess whether initial reforms were being sustained and whether new problems were emerging as the organization continued evolving. Her most recent report had shown continued progress on most metrics. Service timing gaps between white guests and guests of color had narrowed to statistically insignificant levels. Table assignments no longer showed patterns of segregation, even during busy periods. Promotion rates for employees of color had increased to approximate their representation in the overall workforce. But the report had also identified new challenges that emerged from transformation efforts themselves. Some white employees felt they were being held to different standards or that workplace had become too politically correct. Some longtime customers had complained about changes to atmosphere and service style that they perceived as abandoning excellence in pursuit of inclusivity. Some community members remained skeptical that changes were sustainable, rather than temporary responses to negative publicity that would fade once scrutiny decreased. Transformation is not a destination, but an ongoing process, Dr. Morrison had said during her presentation of the most recent audit findings to David, Elena, and the advisory board. You've made significant progress in 6 months, more than many organizations achieve in years of half-hearted effort. But you're also encountering the predictable resistance that accompanies real change. People who benefited from previous systems, pushing back against losing advantages they didn't recognize as advantages. People who equate different with worse, rather than recognizing that inclusion can enhance rather than diminish excellence. People whose discomfort with change manifests as claims that you're abandoning quality or alienating loyal customers. How you respond to that resistance will determine whether Meridian's transformation is genuine and lasting, or whether it reverts to previous patterns once immediate pressure subsides. Her assessment had been clear-eyed and challenging, neither dismissing progress nor allowing anyone to become complacent about ongoing work that would be required. Marcus Bennett had ultimately filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Meridian, claiming that his firing had been precipitous and discriminatory against him as a white man who'd been scapegoated to protect the restaurant's image after Elena's video went viral. The lawsuit made local news and generated some social media discussion, mostly mocking the premise that a white man faced discrimination for engaging in racial profiling, though some commentators framed it as example of cancel culture, going too far, and destroying someone's livelihood over a single mistake. David's legal team was confident the lawsuit would be dismissed given the video evidence and witness testimony, but the existence of litigation created ongoing distraction and modest reputational risk. More concerningly, Marcus's lawyer had subpoenaed extensive employment records and communications in discovery process, fishing for evidence that might support claims of inconsistent discipline or preferential treatment for employees of color that could be spun as reverse discrimination. The legal maneuvering was exhausting and expensive, though David remained committed to defending the termination decision rather than settling and potentially legitimizing Marcus's victim narrative. Elena had become something of an inadvertent spokesperson for experiences of racism in service industries, receiving regular invitations to speak at conferences, contribute to media stories, and consult with other businesses attempting to address discrimination in their operations. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes unwelcome. She'd never sought public platform, had simply been trying to surprise her husband for their anniversary when Marcus Bennett's racism had thrust her into viral fame she'd never wanted. But she'd also recognized opportunity to use the attention productively, to amplify conversations about patterns that extended far beyond single incidents, to push for systemic changes rather than just individual accountability. She'd written an essay for a major newspaper about the exhaustion of being black in public spaces, describing the hypervigilance required when shopping, dining, traveling, or simply existing in settings where your presence is treated as suspicious rather than ordinary. The essay had been widely shared and had generated thousands of comments ranging from people of color, sharing their own similar experiences, to white readers expressing surprise or skepticism that such treatment remained common in supposedly enlightened times. "What's been most interesting to me about the response to my story," Elena had said during a podcast interview focused on race and hospitality industries, "is how many white people have told me they had no idea this kind of discrimination still happened with such frequency. They see isolated incidents that make news and they assume those are aberrations, rather than recognizing them as visible examples of patterns that people of color navigate constantly, but that usually don't get captured on video or amplified widely. That disconnection between what people of color experience daily and what white people perceive as the reality of racism in contemporary America, that's part of what makes transformation so difficult. If you don't see the problem or you think it's been largely solved, you're not motivated to support the kind of sustained effort required to actually change systems that produce discriminatory outcomes." Her analysis had been praised by scholars and activists who'd been making similar arguments for years, though she'd been careful to credit the Black women and other people of color whose intellectual and activist labor had long preceded her own viral moment and had created frameworks she was drawing on. David had begun speaking publicly as well, though his approach was different from Elena's, focused less on his own experience and more on what he'd learned about his blindness to discrimination happening in his own business, about the hard work of unlearning racist assumptions and practices he hadn't recognized he'd internalized, about the ongoing discomfort of transformation that required constantly questioning practices he'd previously taken for granted. He'd been invited to speak at a National Restaurant Association conference, and he'd used that platform to challenge industry practices and norms that perpetuated racial exclusion. Everything from hiring practices that privileged pedigree and connections over talent and potential, to tipping systems that disadvantaged workers of color, to aesthetic standards that encoded white cultural preferences as universal markers of quality. His speech had been controversial within the industry, with some restaurateurs appreciating his honesty, while others felt he was being unnecessarily critical or even disloyal to an industry that had provided him with success and prosperity. "I understand that some of you feel I'm being too harsh or that I'm exaggerating problems that you don't see in your own establishments," David had said in response to criticism during the Q&A portion of his conference presentation. "But I thought the same thing 6 months ago. I believed my restaurant was inclusive and welcoming. I believed we treated everyone fairly. I believed problems with racism and hospitality were primarily issues for other businesses, with less enlightened owners and managers. And then my wife was racially profiled and threatened with arrest in my own restaurant, and comprehensive audit revealed systemic patterns of discrimination I'd been completely blind to, despite happening right under my nose for years. That experience taught me that good intentions and progressive self-image don't prevent discriminatory practices, that our industry has deep structural problems that require honest examination rather than defensive denial. So yes, I'm being critical because criticism is necessary if we're going to improve, rather than just congratulating ourselves for being slightly less discriminatory than the most egregious examples we can point to." The advisory board had evolved into more than just oversight mechanism for Meridian's transformation. It had become community space where broader conversations about racial justice, economic inclusion, and community development were happening with increasing sophistication and impact beyond just restaurant operations. Board members had begun collaborating on initiatives that extended beyond Meridian, supporting other local businesses owned by people of color, advocating for policy changes that would make starting and sustaining small businesses more accessible to entrepreneurs without family wealth or establishment connections, developing shared training resources that multiple establishments could use to address discrimination systematically, rather than each business reinventing wheels independently. Martha Williams had been instrumental in facilitating these broader collaborations, using her decades of organizing experience to build coalitions and sustain momentum beyond the initial energy that viral moments generated, but that typically dissipated once media attention moved elsewhere. Jessica Chen's role as Director of Inclusive Excellence had evolved significantly beyond what anyone had initially envisioned, encompassing not just internal Meridian operations, but also external consulting as other restaurants reached out wanting to learn from Meridian's transformation process. She'd developed training programs that she delivered to other establishments. She'd created assessment tools that businesses could use to identify disparities in their own operations. She'd built a network of inclusive excellence professionals across hospitality industry who shared resources and strategies. The work was demanding and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways her previous position as server had never been. I never imagined that speaking up that night when Marcus was profiling Mrs. Wright would lead to completely different career trajectory, she'd reflected during staff meeting. But it taught me that courage matters, that speaking truth to power can actually create change even when it feels risky or futile, and that there are people who will support you when you stand up for what's right, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. The anniversary dinner that had been ruined by Marcus Bennett's racism had been rescheduled multiple times as Elena and David navigated the exhausting work of transformation, media attention, advisory board meetings, and all the other demands that had emerged from that viral moment. They'd finally set new date for 1 year after the original incident, deliberately choosing to mark both their anniversary and the year of intensive work they'd invested in trying to create meaningful change. The dinner was held at Meridian in the same VIP section where Elena had been barred entry, but the atmosphere was completely different. Staff who'd been trained comprehensively on recognizing and interrupting discrimination, systems that tracked service patterns to identify disparities before they became crises, culture that valued inclusive excellence rather than just traditional markers of status and exclusivity. Elena and David sat across from each other at the anniversary table, holding hands and reflecting on everything that had changed in the year since her humiliating encounter with Marcus. "I keep thinking about sliding doors moments," Elena said quietly. "What if my car hadn't needed repairs that day, so I'd driven myself instead of being dropped off in front? What if Marcus had been off that evening and someone else had been managing front of house? What if I hadn't had my phone ready to record so there was no video evidence?" How many other Black women experience similar treatment without any of those protective factors, whose stories never get believed or amplified, who just have to absorb the humiliation and move on because they don't have the platform or the protection that being married to the owner provided me? David nodded, his expression reflecting the weight of those questions. And what if I'd been here when it happened instead of in the kitchen? Would I have recognized immediately what was happening and intervened? Or would I have been blind to it the way I'd apparently been blind to similar patterns for years? I'd like to think I would have seen it clearly and stopped it, but honestly, I'm not sure I would have. That's the hardest thing to accept, that I created and sustained systems that caused harm to people who trusted me to provide safe, welcoming spaces, and I did it through ignorance and privilege rather than malice, which somehow makes it worse because it means the harm was so normalized I couldn't even see it. Their anniversary dinner was interrupted periodically by staff checking in, by advisory board members who'd stopped by to celebrate the milestone with them, by community members who'd heard they were there and wanted to express appreciation for the changes Meridian had undertaken. Each interruption was a reminder that their anniversary was no longer just a private celebration, but had become intertwined with broader community investment in the transformation their relationship and David's business represented. Elena found herself grateful for the support while also mourning slightly the loss of privacy and the way a personal milestone had been subsumed into public narrative. "Do you ever regret that I recorded that video?" she asked David during a quiet moment. "Everything would have been so much simpler if I'd just let it go, if we dealt with Marcus privately, if we hadn't become the face of conversations about racism in restaurants. Your business has taken financial hits. You've spent countless hours on transformation work that takes you away from the cooking and creativity you actually love. And we've both had to sacrifice privacy and deal with public scrutiny we never wanted." David considered the question seriously before responding. "Honestly, no, I don't regret it, even though it's been harder than I ever imagined. Because the alternative wasn't simple. It was allowing harmful systems to continue. It was my ignorance remaining comfortable and unchallenged. It was countless other people experiencing discrimination I never saw or addressed. The video made everything visible and undeniable in ways that forced change I should have pursued proactively, but didn't, because I was too comfortable and too convinced that good intentions were sufficient. I'm sorry you had to experience that racism in that recording. It has cost you privacy and peace. But I'm grateful that your courage in documenting what happened created opportunity for transformation that's hopefully making things better, not just at Meridian but in broader conversations about how service industries treat people of color." That matters more than my comfort or even my business's profitability." He paused, squeezing her hand. "Though I will say I'm looking forward to the day when we can have an anniversary dinner that's just about us, without community members stopping by or advisory board discussions or media inquiries about how transformation is going. Maybe for our 20th? Elena laughed, appreciating the attempt to look forward past the intensity of the current moment. "Maybe by then we'll have solved racism in restaurants and can actually just enjoy a meal without it being a referendum on systemic change and inclusive excellence." They both knew that was unrealistic. Transformation was generational work, not something that would be completed in 5 more years or even in their lifetimes. But the joke captured something true about their longing for normalcy, while also acknowledging that normalcy for people like Elena had always included navigating discrimination. So perhaps what they were actually longing for was a world where Black women could exist in public spaces without their presence being questioned or their belonging being challenged. That world didn't exist yet, but the work of building it was work worth doing even when exhausting, even when costly, even when progress felt incremental rather than revolutionary. Dr. Morrison joined them briefly between courses, pulling up a chair to check in on how they were holding up under the sustained demands of transformation work that had consumed much of the past year. "I've been doing this consulting work for 3 decades, she told them, and I've seen every possible response from organizations that experience racial incidents. Most make cosmetic changes and hope attention fades. Some make genuine short-term reforms but can't sustain them once scrutiny decreases. Very few do the deep, sustained work you've both committed to, especially when it's costly financially and emotionally. I want you to know that what you're building here matters, even on days when it feels futile or when you question whether the effort is worth the personal and professional costs. Meridian is becoming a model that other establishments are studying and attempting to replicate. Your story is being used in educational contexts to teach about systemic racism and organizational transformation. And the advisory board structure you've created is being adapted by businesses in completely different industries. That's impact beyond what most people achieve in lifetimes of activism, and it emerged from your willingness to transform personal trauma into catalyst for systemic change." Her words meant more to Elena than countless messages of support from strangers on social media, because they came from someone who understood intimately how difficult this work was, and how rare it was for organizations to pursue it with genuine commitment, rather than performative gestures. "Dr. Morrison, I have to be honest. There are days when I resent that this became my life's work," Elena admitted. "I'm a public health researcher. My expertise is in maternal health disparities, not restaurant operations or anti-racism training for hospitality workers. Sometimes I feel like I've been conscripted into activism I never chose, like my violation and humiliation became public property that I'm expected to continually perform and process for other people's education and growth. And then I feel guilty for resenting it because I know how much good has come from the visibility of my experience, how many other people have felt less alone in their own encounters with racism because I documented mine and refused to let it be minimized or dismissed." Dr. Morrison nodded with clear understanding of the complicated feelings Elena was articulating. "That ambivalence is completely valid and actually quite healthy. You shouldn't have to be grateful for trauma or enthusiastic about work you never asked for. The fact that good has come from terrible circumstances doesn't make those circumstances less terrible, or mean you have to embrace the identity of spokesperson for every Black woman's experience with discrimination. It's okay to want your life back, to want to focus on your own work and your own family, to set boundaries about what you're willing to engage with publicly. In fact, I'd argue that maintaining those boundaries is essential if you're going to sustain any kind of involvement in this work without burning out completely or coming to resent the very causes you're supporting." She looked between Elena and David. "Both of you have given tremendous amounts of energy and resources to transformation over the past year. You've done more than anyone could reasonably expect, and more than most people in similar positions ever attempt. It's okay to step back, to let other people carry more of the load, to prioritize your own well-being and your marriage over continued public engagement. The work will continue with or without you being at the center of it." The permission to step back was something Elena hadn't realized she needed to hear, and she felt tears forming as the weight of expectation she'd been carrying began to lift slightly. David reached over to wipe tears from her cheeks, his own eyes bright with emotion. "Elena, I'm so sorry that my business and my failure to create truly inclusive culture made you a reluctant activist. You're right that this shouldn't have become your work, that you shouldn't have to educate others from your pain, that you deserve to focus on the research and the life you'd built before Marcus Bennett turned our anniversary into a viral moment. What would you need from me to make that possible? How can I support you stepping back while still maintaining the commitments we've made to transformation? His question was genuine rather than performative, focused on Elena's needs rather than on managing Meridian's reputation or maintaining momentum on reforms that had become associated with both of their names and faces. Elena considered what she actually wanted, rather than what she felt obligated to continue providing. I think I need to be less visible, less available for interviews and speaking engagements, less involved in day-to-day advisory board operations. I want to support the work, and I'm willing to consult on specific questions where my experience is genuinely relevant. But I need to reclaim time and energy for my own career, my own research, my own life, that isn't defined by that night Marcus Bennett racially profiled me. I need our anniversary to be about us again, not about systemic racism and organizational transformation. Does that make me selfish or uncommitted? The question reflected genuine uncertainty about whether pulling back was abandoning responsibility or practicing necessary self-care. Whether she owed continued activism to all the other people who'd experienced similar discrimination, or whether she'd already given more than could reasonably be expected. It doesn't make you selfish, Doctor, Morrison said firmly. It makes you human, and it makes you wise about sustainability. Social movements don't succeed when individuals sacrifice everything until they burn out. They succeed when many people contribute what they can for as long as they can, while maintaining enough well-being to sustain engagement over time. You've done extraordinary work this past year. You've created platforms and structures that will continue functioning without you being the face of them, and you've earned the right to step back and focus on your own priorities. Anyone who judges you for that or suggests you're abandoning important work is asking you to continue performing your trauma for their benefit, which is its own form of violence even when it comes from people with good intentions. She stood to return to her own table. Enjoy the rest of your anniversary dinner. You've both earned the right to celebrate your marriage without it being a public event or a teaching moment. I'll see you next month for the quarterly review, but after that, let's talk about transitioning more of the ongoing transformation work to the advisory board and to Jessica's office, so you two can reclaim some of the normalcy you've been missing. After Dr. Morrison left, Elena and David sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, processing the permission to step back and beginning to imagine what life might look like if they weren't constantly managing crisis or transformation. Do you remember what you got me for our 15th anniversary? Elena asked suddenly. The gift you'd planned before everything happened? David pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket with a slightly sheepish smile. I've been carrying this around for a year, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. It felt wrong to present it that night after everything with Marcus, and then we got so consumed with transformation work that there was never a moment that felt appropriate. But maybe now, on the actual anniversary of that dinner we never got to have, maybe now is the right time. He handed her the package, watching her face as she carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a jewelry box containing a delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like an open book, a reference to Elena's love of reading and to the first edition novel she'd brought that night as her gift to him. The gift that had been forgotten in the chaos of confrontation and still sat wrapped on a shelf in their home. David, it's beautiful, Elena said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift and by his holding on to it through the entire chaotic year, waiting for a moment that felt right. Thank you for remembering what this anniversary was supposed to be about before it became about racism and viral videos and organizational transformation. Thank you for seeing me as your wife rather than just as a symbol or a spokesperson or the face of anti-racism work in hospitality industries. He fastened the necklace around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin, and they sat holding each other across the anniversary table in the same VIP section where she'd been barred entry exactly 1 year earlier. The space had been transformed, but more importantly, they were reclaiming it, filling it with love and partnership and commitment to each other, rather than letting it remain defined by Marcus Bennett's racism and the painful year of work that had followed. The final course arrived, a dessert David had worked with Chef Rodriguez to create specifically for this anniversary, incorporating flavors from their wedding cake 15 years earlier, and from dishes they'd shared at meaningful moments throughout their marriage. As they ate and talked and laughed together for the first time in months without the conversation turning to transformation metrics or advisory board recommendations or media strategy, Elena felt something she hadn't felt since before that terrible night. Simple joy in her husband's company. Simple pleasure in beautiful food and intimate conversation. Simple gratitude for 15 years of partnership that had weathered challenges neither of them could have anticipated when they'd made their wedding vows. The work of transformation would continue. The advisory board would keep meeting. Meridian would continue evolving toward genuinely inclusive excellence, and Elena and David would remain involved at some level because the commitments they'd made mattered and the changes they'd catalyzed were important. But they were also just two people who loved each other, who deserved to celebrate their anniversary without it being a public performance, who'd earned the right to step back from the intensity of the past year and reclaim some of the normalcy and privacy that viral fame had stolen from them. "Happy anniversary, Elena," David said, raising his wine glass in toast. "To 15 years of partnership, to surviving the hardest year either of us has ever experienced, to the future we're going to build together that includes continuing to work for justice but doesn't consume us entirely. I love you more than I can adequately express, and I'm grateful every day that you're my partner in this complicated, messy, beautiful life." Elena touched her glass to his, tears and laughter mixing as she responded, "Happy anniversary, David. To us, to the work we've done together, and to finally getting the anniversary dinner we deserved all along. I love you too, and I'm ready for the next chapter, whatever that looks like, as long as we're facing it together." They drank together in the transformed restaurant that was theirs, surrounded by community that had become invested in their story, but in that moment focused only on each other and on the marriage they'd built and strengthened through fire, that had tested everything they believed about themselves and each other, and the world they were trying to create. Elena and David's story asks us to think about what real accountability looks like after harm has been done. Is firing someone enough? Or do we need deeper transformation? And for those who've experienced discrimination, how do you balance the desire to create change with the need to protect your own well-being and not become defined by your trauma? Share your thoughts below. And if you've found yourself unexpectedly thrust into advocacy work, tell us how you've navigated that complicated terrain. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and help us build a community that believes transformation requires sustained commitment, that personal healing and systemic change aren't opposed but connected, and that love and partnership can survive even the hardest tests if we face them together with honesty and courage. What conversations do we need to have next? What stories help us imagine the world we're trying to build? Thank you for being here and for believing that we can create spaces where everyone belongs, not just in theory, but in the daily reality of how we treat each other.